At Pope John Paul High School in Boca Raton, Florida, 14-year-old Karen Slattery is a bright, promising freshman.
Karen was very confident, liked to have fun.
Hey, Karen. Hi.
You know, when you're walking around and you see this person walking by, you're like, God, she has it all together.
What are you doing this weekend?
I'm babysitting. I'm watching the Helms Girls Saturday night.
You're there almost every weekend.
I know.
They're adorable and they love you, so.
She was very good with little kids. She was always so patient with them, and everybody loved her, so whenever there was an opportunity for her to go and babysit, she would.
I'll catch you later. Bye, Pam.
At the end of the school day, Karen heads home to Delray Beach, where her family is lucky enough to call home.
The homes are affluent. It's very near the beach. It is an idyllic South Florida neighborhood. And because it's across the Intracoastal Waterway from the mainland and near the beach, there always was a sense of friendly isolation from everything else.
One of 3 children, Karen falls right in the middle of the birth order.
My brother, Gene, was already out of the house and in the Navy. And then there's Karen, and she was 4 years older than me. And then I come in the end. My sister and I were close.
Sorry.
Thank you. Oh, I forgot the rules.
So, how was practice today? You girls gonna win your conference this year?
Coach says we have a good shot. Says we lack discipline, though.
Well, okay. So you prove him wrong, all right?
Thanks, Dad.
Everything she did, it just seemed like it was so flawless. Everything that she did, I wanted to do. If she did gymnastics, I did gymnastics. If she was a cheerleader, I was a cheerleader. I was that annoying little sister, but I just wanted to be like her.
This is really good, though.
Thank you.
It was like Norman Rockwell. It's just bad things didn't happen. And if they did, we certainly didn't know about it.
The Slattery family definitely does not know that just a few miles away over in neighboring Boca Raton, something very bad did happen just 6 weeks earlier.
Marilee, man, we'd come home, she put her nightgown on and went to bed. And basically was sleeping when an intruder made his way in. She was beaten about the head severely with what we found out was a pipe wrench. At some point, she managed to get up from the bed. Her bedroom door led out to the main apartment where her folks were. Of course, the ambulance were called, the police were called, and she was taken immediately to surgery. Her skull was pretty much caved in on the one side, and I believe she wound up with a plate in her head. That could have very easily been a homicide. I think the thing that saved her was the fact that she was right across the street from the hospital in town.
But Marilee's attacker has vanished in the wind, and as more than a month goes by with no leads in the case, investigators fear it's only a matter of time before he strikes again.
You got everything you need?
Yes,
Karen, she was always babysitting.
And you're sure Mr. Holmes can give you a ride home?
he always does.
My family knew the Helm family, and those Helm children, they lived on the other side of the Intercoastal, which is supposed to be the nice, safe area because it's the affluent area.
Oh, they said they won't be home till midnight, so don't wait up. I have my key.
Good time.
The house where Karen was babysitting is in an area where the houses, even though they're very expensive, are very close together. It's sort of a South Florida thing. And as a result, neighbors plant a lot of trees, low trees and bushes to sort of create separation, some barriers between the houses. And you can almost come and go without being noticed.
Hey there, Karen.
Hi.
We're just finishing up. Come on in.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes.
Karen's here! Karen's here!
Oh my goodness! What happened to those two little girls I used to babysit? You two are practically teenagers.
That's silly. Still us.
Yeah, and you better act like two well-behaved young ladies tonight, or there'll be no going to the movies tomorrow.
We will.
Well, remember, Karen's the boss. Do whatever she says.
We will, Mommy.
Come on, honey. We're gonna be late.
Oh, help yourself to the fridge. Anything you want. We will be home at midnight. Keep the door locked. We do have our keys.
Got it. You two have fun.
Bye, Mommy.
Bye, girls.
Now, who wants to play a game?
No, you have to braid our hair first. Yeah.
I'm not pulling, am I?
Nope.
No? Okay.
It's not long before Karen and the girls settle into their usual routine.
She could do anything in a French braid, like magazine stuff. Super cool. And she would always do the girls' hair.
I like the movie. It's a good one.
Almost done. Okay. Amy, you're up. You're welcome. Okay, you ready?
That particular time of the year, it was still cool enough that the windows were open, the air conditioning wasn't on.
I want to play a game.
Okay, get your patootie back over there. Let's see what we've got. Okay, do we want Sugarland or Slaps?
It never occurs to Karen that this whole time, she's being watched.
He got around on a bicycle, which actually makes you less obvious. You can just move, because a lot of people in South Florida ride bicycles.
At that point, he went around the back, which would have been the windows to the master bedroom, and ultimately cut an L-shaped cut in the corner of a screen.
Okay, we gotta keep our cards face down until I deal them all out.
Can I go first? No, I want to go first, please.
How about this? We'll go in age order. We'll let Amy go first because she's the youngest, okay?
He managed to climb in and kind of walk out halfway into the hallway to see what was going on out in the living room.
Slaps.
Are you okay?
Paper cut.
Do you want some ointment? My mom has some.
That'd be perfect.
I'll go get it. It's in her bathroom.
Okay, thank you, Becky. Becky? You find it?
In her hometown of Delray Beach, Florida, 14-year-old Karen Slattery is spending her Saturday night babysitting.
Where is your sister? Becky? Did you find it?
Unaware that the three of them are not alone.
Here you go.
You're a lifesaver. Looks like
It's bedtime.
bedtime.
Oh, 10 more minutes, please.
That is what you said 10 minutes ago. You don't want your mom to fire me, do you?
No, we want you to come all the time.
Oh, well, then we gotta do what your mom says. And mom says 9 o'clock is bedtime. Yes, so let's go get our jammies on and our teeth brushed, and I'll come down and read you a story, okay? All right.
But just as soon as the intruder arrived, he leaves the house.
When the prince and the princess looked into each other's eyes, they knew it was true love. And they lived happily ever after.
They all end that way.
That's because they're all princesses. Okay, time for bed. Nights out, ladies. Okay, good night.
Good night. Night.
We are staying down here, Helen. Terry, that radio is at least some kind of communication. If the authorities know what's happening with those 10 people...
With the girls in bed, Karen can finally relax.
We lock ourselves in this dungeon. We may not enjoy living together, but dying together isn't going to solve anything.
Yes, I do want to hear all about it. Okay, all right.
He obviously was intent, had a plan, and followed his plan. He left the residence, and then he returned and confirmed that the children were in their bedroom.
There was no reason for her to be wary. There would have been no reason for her to check the house besides just the routine stuff of having the doors locked. My kids babysat. You know, almost everybody's kids have babysat, you know, for somebody. You just don't think of it. You drive your child over, you drop her off, you say, I'll see you at 10:30 or 11 o'clock, and so she couldn't have been expecting it.
10 p.m., Karen checks in with her mom back at home.
Hi, Mom.
I believe it was something that was done, before my mom went to bed. Check on her and, is everything okay? Which, of course, at the time it was.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'm fine. I'll be fine, Mom. Okay. I love you too. Bye.
Now her mother won't have to worry. Slattery is babysitting two young girls when terror strikes. An hour later, Mr. and Mrs. Helms return home after an enjoyable night out on the town.
Thank you. That was an amazing dinner.
Yeah, food is really good.
I thought so. David?
Lights are out. All of them.
Maybe the powers went out.
Mr. and Mrs. Helm, when they returned home, came into the house and obviously immediately realized something was amiss.
Karen? Karen, we're home.
Maybe she just fell asleep. Oh my God. The girls.
No, walk.
When they saw that there was something amiss, they left the house.
Go next door, call 911. Do it, please, do it. I'll go check on them.
Everybody has that phrase, what's the worst you could imagine? It was the sort of crime that just made you inhale and not let it out for a while.
Minutes later, Delray Beach police arrive on the frantic scene.
You said your girls in the house? The bedroom at the end of the hall. Please, there's blood everywhere. Okay, stay here.
The thinking had been that the Helm children had slept through the whole thing. It just could have been so much worse.
Oh my God.
I feel bad for the Helm family and those Helm children. Thank God he didn't touch those kids. It must have been absolutely devastating for them.
Still, there's one more person unaccounted for inside the house.
The babysitter. Karen, the babysitter. She was in there too. It's okay.
The trail of blood that with drag marks in it led from the place of the attack, the initial attack, which was the kitchen, back to the master bedroom where Karen's body was ultimately found.
Got a body. Clear. I'm checking vitals. She's dead.
Right away, Delray Beach Police Lieutenant Rick Lincoln is called to the scene.
I was involved in probably a couple dozen homicides in my time, but I think the viciousness of this particular attack and the fact that this is a 14-year-old babysitter, without a doubt would rank among the worst crime scenes that I had ever been part of. It obviously appeared that whoever had done this was someone that was in a frenzy. It was a blitz attack, and she never had much of a chance. He attacked her with a knife, slashing Karen's throat.
I think you have to be a professional to see that 18 stab wounds and everything else that went with it was something way beyond just a desire to kill somebody. This was rage, this was evil.
He then dragged her down the hallway by her ankles into the entrance to the master bedroom where he sexually assaulted her.
Was the towel already on her face?
Yeah.
He had covered her face with a towel, and that sometimes is an indicator of remorse, or maybe it was just a practical move on his part to keep blood being transferred to his body from Karen's.
In fact, as investigators process the rest of the scene, it seems the killer took extra care to cover his tracks. No murder weapon or even fingerprint is found inside the house.
Sorry, what?
But outside the house, investigators do find one important clue.
We found bicycle tracks, and the bicycle tracks led from the east, which would have been over on the beach and the public access to A1A, down through another yard and into the Helms' backyard. Just cruising the neighborhood, looking for any opportunity.
I mean, how do you recover from something like that? You can't.
I was so scared that he was going to come after me.
An hour after finding the slain body of 14-year-old Karen Slattery, Delray Beach police arrive at her parents' home to deliver the devastating news.
Yes, officer?
I was in my room. I kept hearing this wailing, this horrible wailing. And I came out of my room, and my mom saw me, and she like grabbed me by my shoulders and shook me and was like, Karen's dead. Karen's dead. I knew what death was. I knew that she wasn't coming back, but in that instant, it definitely wasn't something that I grasped fully.
And I look back now and I think, I have no idea how my mom went through that. It was horrible.
I developed a relationship with Gene Slattery, Karen's dad. I was as candid with him as I could possibly be, just to hope that that might somehow minimize the pain that he and his family were going through. But I drew a lot of strength from that because I felt an even more of an obligation to try and make this thing right, just because of the family members themselves, the survivors.
But the murder of an innocent teen doesn't yield an obvious suspect. So the next morning, Delray Beach police hit the streets, questioning anyone they can in this close beach community.
That type of a violent crime is not typically committed by a stranger. At that point in time, what you're most concerned about is doing your neighborhood canvass and interviews. Because of the type of crime that it was, there were a lot of nervous and uneasy people in that town, there's no doubt about it.
There was pressure on the detectives from within the community, intense pressure, but they didn't really need any outside motivation. This was one of those crimes that produces among good cops a sense of outrage.
Despite detectives' best efforts, 2 weeks pass without any solid leads.
All of the initial leads had been followed through on and hadn't really brought us any closer to identifying the suspect. The trail kind of went cold.
Meanwhile, Karen's killer is still out there somewhere, living off the law enforcement radar. 2 months later, at a college campus in neighboring Boca Raton, Florida, investigators' worst fears come true.
In the area of FAU, there's a female in bed right underneath the window, and the pattern was basically the same, single females home alone. They came face to face inside her house, and he fled.
Turns out this isn't the only incident of its kind. Many women on Florida Atlantic University campus soon come forward with similar tales.
It came to my attention that there was a white male frequenting the campus over there, exposing himself to female college students. One of the women victims drew a kind of a rough hand-drawn composite of what this fellow looked like.
With the sketch in hand, Boca Raton police get right to work searching for a match.
We kept a separate mug book for all sex offenders or sex-related crimes. So I got hold of that book with the rough drawing and picked out a photograph of an individual that sort of resembled the little drawing that the FAU police officer gave me. And his name was Dwayne Owen.
Yeah, hi, this is Sergeant Kevin McCoy with the Boca Raton Police Department.
And when detectives look into Dwayne Owen's background, they find even more details of interest.
We'd found out that he'd been arrested in Delray Beach for indecent exposures. He was arrested back in '82 in Boca for loitering and prowling charge.
You know, kids were scared. They didn't know what was going on. I know there were a lot of girls who didn't want to babysit anymore. And there were probably a lot of families who didn't necessarily want to leave their kids alone at night.
Owen is sounding more like he's their killer. But to be sure they've got the right guy, Sergeant McCoy reaches back out to the college girls who came in contact with this suspect. There's just one problem.
Yeah, I'd love to have you come down to the station and take a look at some pictures. See if you might be able to identify that man that was in your apartment.
We ran into the Memorial Day weekend.
I understand.
And found out that the young ladies had left to go to the Keys.
Okay, thank you.
So we couldn't do the lineup until they got back.
The delay proves costly.
The following day, there in Boca, Georgina Warden, she apparently was laying in bed reading.
Unfortunately, she had shears on the window, so you could look in the window and see her right there, sleeping in the bed. This guy was intent on getting in, and he was in there to do harm.
2 months after the violent murder of Delray Beach teen Karen Slattery, 38-year-old Georgiana Warden is brutally attacked in neighboring Boca Raton, Florida.
Miss Warden was bludgeoned to death with a hammer. It was overkill. I responded to the call as well as several other detectives. The homicides that I've been involved in, very few and far between, that brutal.
Crimes of this magnitude are rare in these small Florida communities, so police wonder, could there be a connection to Karen Slattery's murder in neighboring Delray Beach?
Cut screens in both cases, entries into bedrooms. The fact that there were children sleeping in other parts of the house in both cases was another similarity.
Ms. Warden stuck in my mind, obviously, because she was murdered, but it was her daughters who found her. And I just couldn't imagine those poor girls finding their mom that way.
But with no clue who the man behind these two crimes may be, crime scene samples are collected and sent off for testing, with hopes that they will yield a more definitive connection. Meanwhile, Sergeant Kevin McCoy circles back to the college campus.
Have a seat,
where a man was recently reported to be exposing himself to several students.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
With the Memorial Day weekend, we weren't able to do a photo lineup with the victims over at FAU. But after the young ladies came back from the Keys, we did the lineup.
I know this isn't easy. Tell me if you see anyone you recognize.
That's him.
This guy right here? You're sure?
Absolutely.
We did the lineup, and she positively identified Mr. Owen's photograph. He's been involved in the indecent exposures. He's involved in a burglary where there's a female in bed right underneath the window, just like Warden.
With that positive ID, police have cause to bring Dwayne Owen in for questioning.
Hey, it's McCoy. Need to get an APB on Dwayne Eugene Owen.
We issued a bulletin for him, be on the lookout, so to speak, and went from there.
Then, less than 24 hours later, a Boca Raton police officer spots someone matching Owen's description.
Myself and 2 other detectives responded up to the scene. We saw him, and of course there was no doubt in my mind who it was.
Police arrest Dwayne Owen on indecent exposure charges. But the line of questioning quickly turns to the murders of Georgiana Warden and Karen Slattery. Owen doesn't make it easy for detectives.
It was a cat and mouse game. We're running around with a bunch of pieces trying to tie them together, and of course now he's trying to find out what we know.
Are there any other victims out there?
Oh, no. Roses are red, yellow, white, and pink. To play my game, you have to think.
He was, obviously, he saw this as some type of a chess game between him and the police, and ultimately thought that he was, the better player.
So here you come all over the world trying to figure out if there's any more homicides.
Yeah, you know I will. What is the number? Is it 2 or is it 5 or is it more?
No, it's 2.
Is that the truth?
Yeah. Number 5 means something too.
But by now, evidence from the Georgiana Warden crime scene has come back, and now police have the only evidence they need to confirm this is their man.
Been identified. The man does have your fingerprint. That's no lie.
The fingerprint was obviously very, very important, because other than that, he had nothing to tie him to the scene.
Faced with the evidence against him, Dwayne Owen finally confesses to the murder of Georgiana Warden.
Just figured I'd just go up there and write for you. Instead, I figured it will help me. Maybe I'll just hit her once, and then that way she'll get knocked out.
I'd have to say that was a game breaker. There was no doubt that if he was good for theirs, then he was good for ours as well.
So detectives turn the questioning to Karen Slattery's murder.
It's really not difficult to put the 2 cases together, though, Dwayne. The Boki case and our case. You know what I mean?
I guess. Just trying to think of, think of a way out? No, there ain't no way out. There ain't no way out. You guys gotta be good, man.
Realizing his secret is now out, Dwayne Owen decides to tell police exactly what happened to Karen Slattery that night in March 1984.
It was totally random. He was just prowling through the neighborhood and saw Karen, and that obviously interested her.
Yeah, she invited at me when we didn't talk. And then I took her to the bathroom.
How'd you take her?
Just grabbed her feet and drug her.
Well, he didn't suggest that he had any remorse about any of it. He was kind of proud of his work, so we knew we had the right guy at a point in time.
In October 1985, Dwayne Eugene Owen is convicted of the murders of Karen Slattery and Georgiana Warden and is sentenced to die in the electric chair. He remains on death row. It's been more than 30 years since Karen Slattery was murdered, but her family says they are still waiting for justice.
I mean, he's obviously not a good guy. The fact that this guy is still sitting in jail, it's frustrating. It's frustrating, you know? She was a good kid. She didn't deserve to have this happen to her. He took away a lifetime of a friendship, took away my innocence of childhood.
In the wake of Karen's devastating murder, Karen's sister Debbie has become a police officer.
I didn't sleep at night. Going into law enforcement probably was a good thing for me because I worked nights, so I was up anyway. So fighting crime and...
There are some deaths that leave behind a body. There are others that leave behind a question. And then there are deaths that leave behind an entire false identity. For more than 2 decades, investigators in Oklahoma believe they knew the woman who had died after being struck by a vehicle in a hit-and-run accident. Her name was Tanya Hughes. She was young. She was a mother. She was barely 20 years old. And on a spring day in 1990, she was walking through Oklahoma City when a vehicle struck her and disappeared. Tanya survived the impact, but only for a few days. 5 days later, she was dead. At first glance, it looked like a tragic traffic case. A young woman hit by a driver who fled. Another name entered into a police file. Another death absorbed by a city that had no idea something much darker had just happened. But Tanya Hughes was not Tanya Hughes. And the man standing beside her life was not the man he claimed to be. His name, according to records, was Clarence Hughes. He presented himself as Tanya's husband. He claimed to be the father of her little boy, Michael. But behind that name was a fugitive, a man whose real name was Franklin Delano Floyd. And behind Tanya's identity was a childhood that had been stolen years before she ever reached Oklahoma. The strange story did not begin in 1990. It began much earlier. It began with a little girl named Suzanne Marie Savakis. She was born on September 6, 1969, in Michigan. She was the oldest daughter in a family that would eventually be torn apart by circumstance, instability, and a man who would spend decades moving through American society under different names. Floyd entered the family's life in the 1970s. According to the account he later gave FBI investigators, he married Suzanne's mother in North Carolina in 1974 under the name Brandon C. Williams. The family moved to Texas. Then everything changed. Suzanne's mother was jailed on minor charges in Dallas. The children were suddenly vulnerable, and Floyd made a decision that would alter Suzanne's life forever. He took Suzanne. Her two younger sisters were left at a children's home. Suzanne disappeared with him. She was still a child. There was no public disappearance that immediately shook the country. No national search that lasted for years. No Amber alert. No social media. No digital trail. Just a child removed from one life and inserted into another. Floyd eventually surfaced in Oklahoma City. And there, according to investigators, he began presenting Suzanne as his daughter. But that was only the beginning. Years passed. Suzanne grew older. Her identity changed. Her name changed. Her relationship with Floyd changed. And eventually, she became the young woman known to the world as Tanya Hughes. By 1990, she was living in Oklahoma with a little boy named Michael. Then came the collision, the impact, the hospital, the questions, and 5 days later, the death that remained strangely unresolved for decades. Floyd, meanwhile, had vanished. He did not remain beside the family. He did not remain available to investigators. He disappeared into another chapter of his criminal history. And the little boy, Michael Hughes, was left behind. That detail will become one of the most disturbing pieces of the entire case. Because Michael was not simply the child of a dead mother. He was the child of a woman whose identity had been stolen. And the man claiming to be his father was not his father at all. The truth began surfacing almost immediately after Tanya's death. Investigators discovered that Clarence Hughes was actually Franklin Delano Floyd. He was a federal fugitive from Georgia, wanted since 1973. 2 months after Tanya's death, Floyd was arrested in Georgia. He was returned to prison. A blood test was conducted. The result was devastating. Floyd was not Michael's biological father. But that did not stop him. When Floyd was released from prison in 1993, he went after Michael. He wanted the boy. And in September 1994, he took him from an elementary school. Michael was 6 years old, a first grader, a child walking into an ordinary school day. Then a man arrived and took him away. 2 months later, authorities caught Floyd in Kentucky. Michael was gone. Floyd would not explain where the boy was. The search began. Investigators looked for answers. Floyd remained largely silent. Then another discovery changed the case again. Photographs were found taped to the gas tank of Floyd's pickup truck. They showed a young woman. She appeared bound and beaten. Her name was Cheryl N. Comesso. Her remains have been discovered near a freeway on-ramp outside Tampa, Florida. The photographs connected Floyd to her, and investigators eventually charged him with her murder. In 2002, Floyd was convicted and sentenced to death. But even that conviction did not explain what had happened to Tanya Hughes. It did not explain where Michael was. And it certainly did not explain why a young woman who appeared to have been living an ordinary life had actually spent her childhood under another identity. Then, more than 20 years after Tanya's death, the FBI reopened the case. In 2013, agents with the FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children conducted a cold case review. The case was old. The witnesses were scattered. The memories were fading. The physical evidence was decades old. But one thing had changed. Technology. DNA. Modern investigative databases. And investigators who were willing to look at the case as something more than a traffic death. Special Agent Scott Lobb began working the case from the FBI's Oklahoma City division. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger it became. Tanya Hughes was not simply a woman who had died in a hit and run. She was a missing child who had grown into an adult under a stolen identity. And Franklin Delano Floyd was not simply her husband. He was the man who had controlled the story surrounding her life. He was the man who knew where she came from. He knew her real name. He knew what happened to her childhood. And he knew what happened to Michael. The FBI eventually obtained enough information to connect Tanya Hughes to Suzanne Marie Savakis. DNA confirmed it. The woman who had died in Oklahoma City in 1990 was Suzanne. The little girl taken away in the 1970s had grown up under another name. For 24 years, investigators had not known the true identity of the woman whose death they were trying to understand. Now they did. But identifying the victim was not the same as solving her death. It was only another door opening. And behind that door was an even darker question. What had Franklin Delano Floyd done to the people whose lives he had taken control of? In 2014, FBI agent Scott Lobb and Nate Furr spent hours interviewing Floyd in prison. He was older now. His health was failing. He had spent years on death row. He had every reason to remain silent. But investigators kept asking. They asked about Tanya. They asked about Suzanne. They asked about Michael. They asked about the years in Oklahoma. They asked what happened after the boy disappeared. For a long time, Floyd resisted. Then something changed. The man who had spent decades hiding behind false names began talking. He told investigators that he had taken Suzanne from her family. He described how he had moved her to Oklahoma. He described the false identity. And eventually he addressed Michael. The 6-year-old boy had not disappeared by accident. Floyd admitted that Michael was dead. He told investigators that he had taken the boy from Oklahoma City on September 12, 1994. They drove toward Dallas. Michael, according to Floyd, behaved like an ordinary 6-year-old. He was restless. He was difficult. He was a child. And Floyd said he lost his patience. Then came the confession. Floyd told investigators that he shot Michael twice in the back of the head. The words transformed a kidnapping investigation into a murder investigation. For 20 years, the boy had been missing. Now investigators knew what Floyd claimed had happened. But there was still no body. Floyd told investigators that he had buried Michael near the final interstate exit leaving Oklahoma. Someone had reportedly seen a suspicious man with a young boy at a rest area near the Oklahoma-Texas border on the day Michael disappeared. The description fit Floyd's story. The FBI searched. Evidence response team personnel arrived. Anthropologists from the University of Oklahoma joined the effort. Investigators narrowed the search area. They examined the earth. They searched for shell casings. They looked for anything that might have survived 2 decades underground. Even small metal eyelets from a child's shoes could have become crucial evidence. But the ground gave them nothing. 2 days of searching. A large area examined. No body. No definitive physical evidence. The confession remained. The location remained uncertain. And Tanya's death remained an entirely different mystery. Because Floyd had talked about Michael. He had talked about Suzanne. He had talked about the past. But when investigators turned toward the question of Tanya's death, he stopped. That silence became its own kind of evidence. Not proof. Not an answer. But a wall. A wall that had survived decades. The FBI had finally identified Tanya Hughes. They had finally learned that she was Suzanne Marie Savakis. They had uncovered the kidnapping that had stolen her childhood. They had connected Floyd to the disappearance and murder of her son. They had searched for Michael. They had listened to Floyd confess. Yet the central question remained. Who killed Tanya Hughes? Was the hit and run really an accident? Was she deliberately targeted? Did someone know who she really was? Did Floyd know more than he admitted? And if he did, why would he refuse to say it? For investigators, the case became a haunting contradiction. The truth had finally arrived, but it had arrived incomplete. A woman's real name had been recovered. A child's fate had been revealed. A criminal had confessed to one murder. Yet another death remained suspended in uncertainty. The city had once known Tanya Hughes as a young mother. Her family had known her by another name. Her biological relatives had spent years without knowing what had become of Suzanne. And somewhere inside the FBI's files, 2 identities were finally brought together. Tanya Hughes. Suzanne Marie Savakis. 2 names. 1 woman. 1 stolen childhood. 1 unexplained death. And 1 man who appeared to have carried the answers with him for decades. Franklin Delano Floyd. He had spent years changing names, changing stories, changing locations, leaving behind fragments of people who had disappeared into his orbit. But time eventually caught up with him. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, not through a single piece of evidence, but through persistence. DNA, old court records, cold case review, interviews, and the refusal of investigators to accept that a mysterious young woman's death should remain only a forgotten file. More than 30 years after Tanya Hughes died, the mystery had become clearer. But clarity was not closure, because knowing who Tanya really was did not tell the world who caused her death. And knowing what happened to Michael did not bring the boy home. The ground near the Oklahoma-Texas border remained silent. The search produced no body. Floyd's confession could not answer every question. And the woman at the center of the case could finally be called by her real name, Suzanne Marie Savakis. A little girl taken from her family. A young woman who lived under a name that was never truly hers. A mother. A victim. And finally, decades after her death, a person whose real identity was returned to her. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the case is not what investigators eventually discovered. It is what they still cannot prove. The final moments of Tanya Hughes' life remain obscured. The driver who struck her was never brought into the light by the investigation described in the FBI's account. The circumstances surrounding the crash never received the same confession that Michael's disappearance eventually did. And Franklin Delano Floyd, the man who knew more about Suzanne's life than almost anyone else, took that secret with him. The case therefore remains divided between two truths. One truth was uncovered. The other remains buried. For decades, Tanya Hughes was a name attached to a death. Then the FBI discovered the woman behind the name. She was Suzanne. She had been stolen as a child. She had been renamed. Her past had been erased. And even after investigators restored her identity, the final mystery remained untouched. Why did Tanya die? What happened in the moments before the vehicle struck her? Who was behind the wheel? Was it a random tragedy? Or was a collision connected to the secret life that Floyd had spent years trying to control? There is no definitive answer in the FBI account. Only questions. And sometimes in a cold case, questions are what survive the longest. The investigation into Tanya Hughes did not end with a courtroom revelation. It did not end with a grave. It did not end with a confession. It ended with a name. Suzanne Marie Savakis. A name that had been missing for more than 20 years. A name returned to a family that had spent decades wondering what happened to their daughter. And somewhere in that restored identity is the cruelest irony of all. For years, investigators were searching for Tanya Hughes. But Tanya Hughes was never the whole story. She was Suzanne. And Suzanne had already disappeared long before Tanya ever died. The mystery was not simply how a young woman died. The mystery was how an entire life could be taken from her so completely that even after death, investigators had to spend decades discovering who she really was. That is what makes the case endure. Not merely the violence. Not merely the disappearance. Not merely the confession. But the silence. A silence stretching from a stolen childhood in the 1970s, through Oklahoma City in 1990, through the disappearance of a 6-year-old boy in 1994, through decades of prison interviews, court records, DNA testing, and cold case investigation. And at the center of it all stood one man, Franklin Delano Floyd. He knew Suzanne's real name. He knew where she came from. He knew what happened to Michael. And when investigators finally asked him about Tanya's death, the answers stopped. The silence remained. The years passed. The case became a cold case. But cold does not mean forgotten, because every unanswered question leaves a door open. And sometimes, decades later, someone finally finds a key. For Suzanne Marie Savakis, that key was DNA. For Michael Hughes, it was a confession. For Tanya Hughes, the final answer remains missing. And perhaps that is why the case still haunts Oklahoma. Because the FBI managed to unravel one of the most extraordinary identity mysteries surrounding the woman known as Tanya Hughes. They discovered the child behind the name. They exposed the fugitive behind the husband. They uncovered the fate of the little boy. But the last secret stayed locked away. The secret of how Tanya Hughes died. More than 30 years later, the name is no longer just Tanya Hughes. It is Suzanne Marie Savakis. And the story is no longer just about a hit and run. It is about a stolen identity, a missing child, a murdered boy, a convicted killer, a confession, a search through Oklahoma soil, and one final question that refuses to disappear. Who was responsible for the death of Suzanne Marie Savakis? Until that question is answered, the case is not truly finished. The file may be old. The evidence may be cold. The witnesses may be gone. The memories may have faded. But the question remains. And somewhere in the silence left behind by Franklin Delano Floyd, the final answer may still be waiting. The silence surrounding Suzanne Marie Savakis did not begin in Oklahoma. It began years earlier, when she was still a child and had no understanding of how completely a person's identity could be taken away. Before the headlines, before the FBI, before the name Tanya, Hughes appeared in police records. There was only Suzanne, a little girl growing up in a family whose life was already unstable, a child who could not possibly have understood the danger represented by the adults around her, a child who trusted the people responsible for protecting her. Then Franklin Delano Floyd entered the picture. Years later, investigators would reconstruct pieces of that history. But reconstruction is not the same as witnessing. There were gaps. There were conflicting memories. There were documents that did not match. There were names that changed. And there was Floyd, moving to the country with the ability to reinvent himself whenever the past began catching up. Suzanne disappeared into that world. The disappearance was not dramatic. There was no abandoned suitcase at an airport, no desperate note, no witness watching a vehicle speed away. Instead, there was a child who simply stopped being where her family expected her to be. That distinction matters, because missing children are often imagined through the lens of sudden violence. A stranger, a dark street, a vehicle, a scream. Suzanne's disappearance was different. The person who took her was someone who had already gained access to her family. That made the disappearance harder to understand, and potentially harder to detect. She was not simply missing. She was being moved. She was being renamed. She was being absorbed into another identity. By the time investigators eventually encountered a woman called Tanya Hughes, the original child had effectively disappeared from the official record. That is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Suzanne did not vanish from the world. She remained alive. She grew up. She became a mother. She interacted with neighbors. She existed in public. But the identity attached to her life was false. The person looking at her could see a woman. The government could see a name. The records could see a history. But none of those things necessarily described a real person. Then came 1990. Oklahoma City. A roadway. A vehicle. A sudden impact. And a young woman lying injured. There was nothing about the scene that immediately announced the scale of the mystery. Investigators were confronted with a traffic victim. The priority was medical treatment. The hope was survival. The expectation was that the driver would eventually be found. But 5 days later, Tanya Hughes died. The case changed instantly. Now, there was a dead woman, a missing driver, a child left behind, and a husband who would soon prove to be something entirely different. Floyd did not simply walk away from the tragedy. He became part of the mystery surrounding it. That distinction would become critical, because when investigators examined his identity, the name Clarence Hughes began to collapse. The man was actually Franklin Delano Floyd, and Floyd was already a fugitive. The discovery should have triggered a much deeper examination of the people around him. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, piece by piece. Years would pass before investigators understood what they were really looking at. A dead woman, a missing child, a fugitive, and a false family. The tragedy might have remained buried in old records if not for Michael Hughes. Michael was a little boy. He was also the person who kept the past connected to the present. After Tanya's death, he remained in Floyd's orbit. That alone was dangerous. But in 1994, Floyd went back for him. September 12th. A school. A 6-year-old child. A man arriving to take him away. The disappearance immediately became more serious than a custody dispute. Authorities discovered Floyd's criminal history. They discovered that he was wanted. They learned that the boy was in danger. Then Floyd was arrested. But Michael was gone. For the investigators searching for him, the clock was brutal. Every hour mattered. Every mile mattered. Every statement from Floyd mattered. But Floyd did not tell them where the boy was. The investigation expanded. Search teams worked through possible locations. Tips came in. Questions multiplied. What had happened after Floyd left the school? Where had he taken Michael? Was the boy still alive? Could he have been hidden somewhere else? And then came the photographs. They were found in Floyd's truck. Photographs of a woman. The images were disturbing. They depicted Cheryl Ann Camesso. Her body had already been discovered in Florida. The discovery transformed the investigation. Floyd was no longer merely a fugitive connected to a missing child. He was now linked to another murder. The case moved toward prosecution. Eventually, Floyd was convicted of Camesso's murder and sentenced to death. But the mystery surrounding Michael remained. And Tanya remained at the center of the story. Because if Floyd had murdered Camesso, what else had he done? If he had kidnapped Suzanne, what had happened during the years they were together? If he had taken Michael, what had happened to the boy? And what did Floyd know about Tanya's death? Those questions followed him into prison. Years passed. Technology changed. Investigative techniques improved. Cold case investigators began re-examining old files with tools unavailable in 1990. And one of the most important tools was DNA. A name could be falsified. A birth certificate can be wrong. A story can be invented. But genetic identity is different. The FBI and its partners eventually established what earlier investigators could not. Tanya Hughes was Suzanne Marie Savakis. The mystery of her identity was finally broken. The discovery reached backward through time. Suddenly, the little girl who had disappeared decades earlier was connected to a young woman who had died in Oklahoma. The two people were one. And the revelation changed the meaning of everything that came before it. This was no longer merely a case involving an unidentified history. It was the story of a child whose identity had been stolen. The woman killed in Oklahoma was not simply Tanya Hughes. She was someone who had been missing from her original family for years. That realization made the case more painful, because her family had not simply lost her in 1990. They had lost her much earlier. They had spent years not knowing where she was. And when she finally died, they did not even know the name under which she had been living. The investigation had uncovered an extraordinary truth, but it also created an unbearable question. How much did Suzanne herself know? Did she remember her original family? Did she know her real name? Did she understand who Floyd really was? Did she believe the story he told her? Did she have a chance to escape? There are questions that investigators can answer with evidence. And there are questions that disappear with a victim. These belong to the second category. Suzanne could no longer speak. Floyd could. And eventually, investigators sat across from him. He was older. His life had narrowed to prison walls and legal proceedings. The man who had once moved from state to state was now physically contained. But the secrets remained. Investigators pressed him. They wanted Michael. They wanted Suzanne. They wanted the truth. And Floyd began talking. His admissions were horrifying. He acknowledged taking Suzanne. He acknowledged the false identity. And then he described what happened to Michael. According to Floyd's account, the boy was killed after being taken from Oklahoma. 2 gunshots. The back of the head. A child who had been alive that morning. A child whose disappearance had generated years of uncertainty. Now, there was an alleged explanation. But investigators still needed the body. Floyd gave them a location. Near an interstate. Near the Oklahoma-Texas border. The search began. Imagine the scene. Investigators standing on ground where a child might have been buried for nearly 20 years. Every patch of disturbed earth mattered. Every piece of debris could have significance. Every shovel of soil carried the possibility of ending a family's nightmare. They searched. They examined. They looked for evidence that time had failed to erase. But the ground remained silent. No definitive remains were recovered. No final physical confirmation came. For Michael's family, that meant the confession could never provide the complete closure that a recovered body might have offered. And for investigators, it meant another layer of uncertainty. Floyd had spoken. But how much of what he said was true? How much had been altered? How much had been omitted? The questions were especially important when investigators turned back to Suzanne. Floyd had provided information about Michael. He had provided information about his relationship with Suzanne. But the circumstances surrounding her death remained unresolved. The woman had been struck by a vehicle. She died days later. The driver was never brought into the center of the story. The evidence did not produce a definitive explanation connecting Floyd to the crash. And so the investigation reached a strange boundary. Investigators had uncovered a remarkable amount of information, yet the most basic question about Tanya's death remained unanswered. Why? Why did she die? Why was she walking where she was walking? Who was driving? Was the collision intentional? Was it accidental? Did Floyd know what happened? Was Suzanne trying to escape? Was she involved in circumstances that investigators never discovered? Or was the death simply a terrible accident that became entangled with a much larger criminal history? There is no definitive answer. That uncertainty is important. Because cold cases are often transformed by time into stories where every unexplained detail begins to look like evidence of conspiracy. But investigators must separate suspicion from proof. The truth is sometimes less dramatic. Sometimes a mystery survives because the evidence disappeared. Sometimes because witnesses died. Sometimes because records were incomplete. Sometimes because the people who knew the answer refused to speak. And sometimes because the only person who could have explained everything chose silence. In Suzanne's case, that silence came from the man who had controlled so much of her life. Franklin Delano Floyd. He knew where she came from. He knew the identity she had lost. He knew the identity she used. He knew Michael. And he knew the events that surrounded both mother and child. Yet the final explanation for Suzanne's death remained outside the reach of investigators. That is why the case remained so unsettling. The FBI solved the identity mystery. But identity is not the same as justice. They discovered who Tanya really was. They established that she was Suzanne. They uncovered Floyd's role in taking her from her family. They heard his confession regarding Michael. But a complete answer about her death never emerged. And that means the title of the case can be misleading if taken too literally. The FBI did not simply arrive decades later and solve every mystery. They unraveled layers. They exposed a hidden identity. They connected a missing child to a dead woman. They brought a long-buried story back into the public record. But one final piece remained missing. The exact truth of the moment Suzanne's life ended. More than 30 years later, that distinction matters. Because families deserve facts. Not theories. Not speculation. Not rumors. Facts. And in this case, the facts are already disturbing enough. A child disappeared. A false identity was created. A young woman died. Her son disappeared. A fugitive was arrested. A murder conviction followed. A confession emerged. A search was conducted. DNA restored a real name. And still, One question remained standing after everything else had fallen away. Who was responsible for the death of Suzanne Marie Savakis? The answer may be hidden somewhere in an old police report, a forgotten witness statement, a piece of evidence never properly understood, a memory that someone carried for decades. Or perhaps it exists only in the mind of someone who will never reveal it. That is the cruel nature of a cold case. Time does not necessarily destroy the mystery. Sometimes time preserves it. It freezes unanswered questions. It allows them to survive long after the people involved are gone. And in Oklahoma, the name Tanya Hughes became one of those questions. But now there's another name. Suzanne Marie Savakis. A name that should never have been forgotten. A name that should never have needed to be recovered from a false identity. And a name that remains attached to a story that still does not have its final chapter. Because the most chilling discoveries in a cold case are not always the answers. Sometimes they're the questions that become sharper after the truth begins to emerge. Who was Suzanne before Floyd took her? What did she remember? What did she fear? What did she know? What happened to her in the days before the collision? And what happened in the moments immediately before a vehicle struck her? Those questions remain. The years have passed. The evidence has aged. The witnesses have scattered. But the story refuses to disappear. Because somewhere beneath the false name of Tanya Hughes was a little girl named Suzanne. And somewhere behind the fugitive identity of Franklin Delano Floyd was a man who knew the truth about the lives he had destroyed. The FBI found part of that truth. DNA revealed another part. Floyd's own words revealed another. But the final silence remains. And until that silence is broken, the case of Tanya Hughes will remain what it has always been at its core. A cold case. A stolen identity. A missing child. A murdered boy. A mysterious death. And a question that has survived more than 30 years. Who really killed Suzanne Marie Savakis? The answer is still out there. And that is what makes this case impossible to forget. The most disturbing thing about the Tanya Hughes case is that the mystery did not begin with her death. It began with her identity. Long before investigators stood over an old case file in Oklahoma, long before DNA testing connected two names that appeared to belong to different women, there was a little girl named Suzanne Marie Savakis. She had a family. She had sisters. She had a mother. She had a life that, despite its instability, belonged to her. Then Franklin Delano Floyd entered that life. And everything changed. The years that followed were not a simple sequence of events. They were a maze. Different names. Different states. Different versions of the same story. Floyd had learned how to exist between identities. He could become someone else. He could tell people what they wanted to hear. He could disappear when questions became dangerous. And Suzanne was caught inside that world. By the time she became an adult, the girl named Suzanne had been replaced in the public record by another name, Tanya Hughes. To neighbors, she was Tanya. To authorities, she was Tanya. To the people who encountered her during those final years, she was Tanya. But somewhere beneath that name was a history that had been erased. That erasure will become one of the greatest obstacles investigators faced. Because when someone disappears under a false identity, investigators are not merely searching for a missing person. They are searching for a person whose existence may have been deliberately concealed. Every document becomes suspect. Every photograph becomes important. Every memory has to be reconsidered. And every name has to be tested. In 1990, investigators did not have the technology they would later have. DNA databases were not what they are today. Digital records did not exist in their modern form. Information did not move instantly between agencies. A missing person in one state could remain invisible to investigators in another, and Floyd understood the value of distance. He had spent years moving. He knew that a new location could create a new story. Oklahoma was simply another place where that strategy worked. Until Tanya died. The collision was sudden. The consequences were permanent. She was taken for medical treatment. She survived for several days. Then she died. Her death should have ended one chapter and begun another. Instead, it created a mystery that would remain buried for decades. The man known as Clarence Hughes was connected to the dead woman. But Clarence Hughes did not exist in the way investigators believed. The name belonged to another identity. The man behind it was Floyd. And once authorities discovered who he really was, the case became more complicated. Because Floyd was not an ordinary witness. He was a fugitive. His past was already marked by criminal activity. His identity was already false. And the young woman beside him was not who she appeared to be. Still, there was no immediate explanation for the larger truth. No one could simply look at the case file and see Suzanne. No one could simply run her DNA and receive an instant answer. The technology did not yet exist. The investigation moved forward with incomplete information. And then Michael disappeared. That event changed everything. A 6-year-old boy was taken from his school. The man who took him was the same fugitive connected to Tanya Hughes. Suddenly, investigators had a missing child and a suspect with a history of deception. The urgency was enormous. Children disappear. But children taken by fugitives are especially vulnerable. The authorities found Floyd. They arrested him. But Michael was nowhere to be found. That was the beginning of another decades-long mystery. The boy became a name on a missing person case. His photograph could be shown. His description could be circulated. Investigators could search. Families could hope. But the person who knew the answer remained silent. Floyd's silence became one of the defining features of the investigation. Years passed. The case did not disappear. It simply grew colder. Meanwhile, Floyd faced another murder investigation. Cheryl and Comesso, a woman found dead in Florida. Photographs connecting her to Floyd. A prosecution. A conviction. A death sentence. And still Michael remained missing. Still Tanya's death remained unexplained. The case seemed to contain several separate crimes. But eventually, investigators realized that the same man connected them. Floyd was a thread. The more investigators pulled, the more complicated the story became. Then came the cold case review. Years after the original investigation, agents looked again. Not because they expected an easy answer. Because sometimes old cases require new eyes. Investigators went back to the beginning. They looked at Tanya. They looked at Floyd. They looked at Michael. They looked at the names. They looked at the photographs. And they looked at the possibility that Tanya Hughes had never actually existed under that name. That possibility was extraordinary. If Tanya was not Tanya, then every assumption about her life had to be questioned. Her birth, her family, her childhood, her relationships, her history, her entire identity. Then DNA provided a connection. Tanya Hughes was Suzanne Marie Savakis. The name finally came back. It was not a new identity. It was the original identity, the one that had been taken from her. For investigators, the discovery was enormous. For her family, it was devastating and deeply significant at the same time. After decades of uncertainty, they finally knew where Suzanne had gone. They knew what had become of the little girl who disappeared. But the answer came with an unbearable truth. Suzanne had died decades earlier. Her family had not simply been separated from her. They had lost her forever. And for years, they had not even known the identity under which she had lived. That is the kind of discovery that changes the meaning of grief. You cannot mourn someone you do not know is dead. You cannot search for someone if you do not know where to look. And you cannot understand a disappearance if the person has been living under another name. Suzanne had effectively been missing and visible at the same time. She was there. People could see her. But the identity of the person they were seeing was wrong. That paradox is central to the case. It explains why the mystery survived. And it explains why investigators needed decades to begin unraveling it. Then came the prison interviews. Floyd was questioned again. This time, investigators had more information. They knew who Suzanne was. They knew the history. They knew about Michael. They knew about Comesso. They wanted to know what Floyd knew. The interviews became a confrontation between memory and evidence. Investigators presented facts. Floyd responded. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he refused. Sometimes the story changed. But eventually, he admitted something that investigators had been desperate to learn. Michael was dead. According to Floyd, he had killed the boy. The confession was devastating. But it also created a new investigative problem. A confession without a body leaves a dangerous gap. The authorities needed physical evidence. They needed to find Michael. Floyd provided a burial location. The search teams went there. The terrain was examined. The ground was disturbed. The investigators looked for signs of a grave. Nothing definitive emerged. No remains. No complete forensic confirmation. The case was therefore trapped between two worlds. Floyd had provided a statement, but the earth had not confirmed it. And that uncertainty extended to Suzanne. Floyd had spent years controlling the narrative surrounding her. He had taken her as a child. He had changed her identity. He had lived beside her. He had been connected to her son. And he was one of the few people who could potentially explain the final days of her life. Yet the circumstances of her death remain unresolved. This is where the case becomes particularly difficult. There is a temptation to connect every unexplained event to Floyd. The false identity, the kidnapping, the missing child, the murder conviction, the confession, the hit and run. But investigators cannot simply assume that every event is connected because one person appears repeatedly. Evidence must establish the connection. And in the case of Tanya's death, that definitive connection has not been established. The collision remains a mystery. The driver remains unidentified in the FBI account. The circumstances remain uncertain. And that uncertainty has survived decades of investigation. What makes the mystery more disturbing is the timing. Suzanne had already spent years under Floyd's control. Then she was injured. Then she died. And Floyd disappeared. Was that coincidence? Was it something more? There is no definitive public answer. The investigation can establish facts. It cannot manufacture evidence. And the absence of evidence does not automatically prove innocence or guilt. It simply means the question remains open. That distinction matters. Because a cold case is not a blank canvas for speculation. It is a collection of facts surrounded by unanswered questions. The facts in this case are extraordinary enough. A little girl disappears. A fugitive takes her. She grows up under another name. She becomes a mother. She dies in Oklahoma. Her husband is exposed as a fugitive. Her son disappears. The same man is arrested. Another woman's murder links back to him. Years later, DNA reveals the dead woman's real identity. Then Floyd confesses to killing her son. Investigators search for the child's remains. They find no definitive body. And still the mother's death remains unexplained. This is not one mystery. It is several mysteries stacked on top of each other. Each answer reveals another question. Who was Tanya? Suzanne. Who took Suzanne? Floyd. Who was Michael? Suzanne's son. What happened to Michael? Floyd said he killed him. Where was Michael buried? The search failed to produce definitive remains. Who killed Suzanne? Still unresolved. That final question is the one that refuses to disappear. For decades, people had assumed that Tanya Hughes was simply another young woman who died tragically. But she was not. She was a surviving fragment of a childhood that had been stolen. She was a person whose real name had been hidden. She was a mother whose child would also disappear. And she became the center of an investigation that crossed decades, state lines, and identities. The FBI's work did something that time had failed to do. It restored her name. That may sound simple. It was not. A name is more than a label. A name connects a person to family, to childhood, to records, to memories, to the life that existed before someone tried to erase it. For Suzanne's family, hearing that name again meant something. The girl they had lost had been found. Not alive, but found. Her identity had been recovered. Her story had been reconstructed. And the man who took her had finally been identified for what he was. But justice and truth are not always the same thing. Truth can arrive incomplete. Justice can arrive without every question being answered. And sometimes a final missing piece never appears. That is the tragedy of cold cases. They do not always end. They simply stop moving. The investigators retire. The files become older. The evidence becomes fragile. The people who might know something become silent or disappear. But the case remains. And so does the question. For Suzanne Marie Savakis, that question is particularly haunting because so much of her life was hidden from the world. She was taken as a child, renamed, moved, separated from her original family. She became Tanya Hughes. Then she died. And after death, investigators had to work backward to discover who she had been. Imagine how extraordinary that is. Most people spend their lives building an identity. Suzanne's identity was dismantled around her. Then investigators spend decades reconstructing it. The process required patience, records, interviews, DNA, cold case review, and a determination to keep looking when the original investigation had gone cold. But even after all that, one final door remained locked. The circumstances of her death. That is why the case remains haunting. Because investigators came closer. Much closer. They discovered the real name. They uncovered the hidden childhood. They found the criminal at the center of the story. They obtained a confession about the missing child. They searched. They investigated. They reconstructed. Yet the final answer remained outside their reach. And perhaps that is the hardest reality for a family to accept. Sometimes solving a cold case does not mean answering every question. Sometimes it means discovering enough truth to finally understand who the victim was. For Suzanne, that truth came decades too late. But it came. The world eventually learned that Tanya Hughes had another name. A name connected to a family. A name connected to a childhood. A name that had been waiting beneath the surface of the case for more than 20 years. Suzanne Marie Savakis. That name is the thread running through everything. The beginning. The disappearance. the false identity, the motherhood, the death, the investigation, the DNA, the confession, and the unanswered question, who killed her? Until there is a definitive answer, the case cannot be completely closed. And that means somewhere in the files, the story remains unfinished. Not because investigators stopped caring, not because the victim was forgotten, but because evidence has limits. And sometimes the truth survives only in fragments. A photograph, a name, a memory, a confession, a patch of ground, a police report, a DNA match, a question. Together, those fragments created a picture of Suzanne's life. But there is still a blank space where the final answer should be. And that blank space is what keeps the case alive. More than 30 years after Tanya Hughes died, the mystery is no longer simply about a woman who was killed in Oklahoma. It is about a girl who disappeared long before anyone realized she was missing. It is about a man who carried multiple identities. It is about a child whose disappearance remained unanswered for decades. It is about a family forced to wait for a truth that arrived only after most of the original witnesses were gone. And it is about a final mystery that refuses to surrender. The woman called Tanya Hughes finally has her real name back. Suzanne Marie Savakis. But a name is not the same as closure. And until the last question is answered, the story of Suzanne remains exactly where so many cold cases remain, between what investigators know and what someone somewhere still refuses to tell. There's a moment in every cold case when the past stops looking like history and starts looking like evidence. A photograph becomes a clue. A forgotten name becomes a connection. An old address becomes a possible crime scene. A story that once seemed unrelated suddenly fits into the same pattern. That moment came slowly in the case of Tanya Hughes. Nothing about it was simple. The truth did not arrive in one dramatic revelation. It emerged through years of uncertainty, through records that had to be compared, identities that had to be questioned, and investigators who refused to accept that the woman who died in Oklahoma could remain only a name on an old file. The deeper they went, the more disturbing the story became. Because Tanya Hughes had not simply disappeared from the public record. She had been replaced. Her original identity had been buried beneath another one. Suzanne Marie Savakis had existed. Then she vanished. Tanya Hughes appeared. And when Tanya died, Suzanne disappeared again. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. A woman spent much of her life living under a name that was not hers. Then, after her death, investigators spent years trying to discover the name that had been taken from her. For Suzanne's family, the revelation must have felt like receiving two pieces of news at once. The first was that their missing daughter had finally been identified. The second was that she had been dead for years. There was no reunion. No final conversation. No chance to ask what she remembered. Only the realization that the mystery had finally found its victim. And at the center of that realization was Franklin Delano Floyd. His life intersected with Suzanne's at the point where her identity began to disappear. He was there when she was taken. He was there during the years when she lived under another name. He was connected to her son. He was connected to the events that followed. And he remained alive long enough for investigators to confront him with the past. That made the prison interviews crucial. Investigators were no longer searching blindly. They had reconstructed enough of the story to ask specific questions. They could challenge Floyd. They could compare his answers with records. They could test his claims against evidence. But Floyd was still Floyd. A man who had spent decades surviving through deception was unlikely to surrender every secret easily. His statements had to be examined carefully. Every admission raised another question. Every location had to be tested. every detail had to be compared with what investigators already knew. The confession about Michael was one of the most significant developments. For years, Michael had been a missing child. Now Floyd was saying that the child had been murdered. The confession changed the investigation, but it did not make the physical evidence appear. Search teams went looking. The possibility of finally finding Michael's remains was enormous. For investigators, recovering the boy would provide something that words could not. For his family, it could end decades of uncertainty. For the case, it could establish another physical connection between Floyd and the disappearance. But the search produced no definitive remains. The absence was devastating. A missing child remained missing even after the alleged killer described the murder. And that is another reason the Tanya Hughes case resists a clean ending. The case contained confessions without complete physical confirmation. It contains identity confirmation without a complete explanation of death. It contains answers surrounded by unanswered questions. That is the architecture of a true cold case. Every solved piece reveals another unsolved piece. And the most important unresolved piece remains Suzanne herself. What happened to her after she was struck? What was happening in her life during those final days? Was she afraid? Was she trying to leave? Was Floyd nearby? Was a collision connected to her circumstances? Or was it simply an accident that became tangled with the extraordinary criminal history surrounding her? Investigators must live with the difference between possibility and proof. So must anyone telling the story. There is a temptation to build a perfect narrative, to connect every dot, to make every mystery part of one grand design. But reality is rarely that clean. Some dots connect. Others do not. Some evidence points toward an explanation. Other evidence remains silent. And silence cannot be turned into certainty. What can be said with confidence is that Suzanne's life was shaped by deception. The child who disappeared in the 1970s did not simply enter a new chapter. She entered a new identity. That identity followed her into adulthood. It followed her into motherhood. It followed her to Oklahoma. And eventually, it followed her into the grave. The name Tanya Hughes became the name associated with her death. But it was not the name her family had given her. That fact alone makes the case extraordinary. Most missing person cases begin with a family searching for a known identity. This case eventually revealed that the identity itself had been hidden. Investigators were not simply searching for where Suzanne had gone. They were searching for the person she had become. That is why DNA became so important. DNA does not care what name appears on a document. It does not care what someone tells investigators. It connects people biologically. And when the DNA connected Tanya Hughes to Suzanne Marie Savakis, decades of uncertainty suddenly had a direction. The dead woman had a past. The past had a family. And the family had been searching without knowing exactly what they were searching for. The revelation also transformed Floyd's role. He was no longer merely a man connected to a woman named Tanya. He was the person connected to the disappearance of Suzanne. That distinction is enormous, because Suzanne had not simply been living under an unusual name. She had been removed from her original life. The identity of a child had been replaced. And years later, the same man was connected to the disappearance of her own child. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A child taken. A child later missing. 2 generations caught inside the same man's orbit. And in between them, a death that remains unexplained. That is the part of the case that continues to disturb investigators and observers alike. The story is not frightening because it is complicated. It is frightening because it is intimate. The person who controlled Suzanne's identity was not a distant stranger. He was part of her daily life. The person who took Michael was not an unknown predator who appeared from nowhere. He was the man connected to his mother. The danger was inside the circle of trust. That is what makes the disappearance of Suzanne so difficult to comprehend. Children are taught to fear strangers. But Suzanne's story demonstrates a different danger. Sometimes the person who changes a child's life forever is someone already standing inside the family. Someone who knows the child's routines. Someone who knows the family's weaknesses. Someone who understands how easily a story can be changed. And Floyd understood stories. He had different names, different histories, different versions of himself. That ability allowed him to remain hidden for years. But no identity can survive forever if evidence keeps accumulating. Eventually, the real person emerges. In this case, the real person behind Tanya was Suzanne. And the real person behind Clarence Hughes was Franklin Delano Floyd. The false names collapsed. But the mystery did not. The collapse of the identities actually exposed more questions. If Floyd had lied about his own name, what else had he lied about? If he had concealed Suzanne's identity, what else had he concealed about her life? If he had hidden Michael's fate, what else was missing? Those questions became increasingly important as investigators reconstructed the timeline. The timeline itself was disturbing. Suzanne disappears as a child. Years later, she appears under another name. She becomes a mother. She is injured in Oklahoma. She dies. Her son remains connected to Floyd. Then Michael disappears. Floyd is arrested. Years pass. DNA identifies Suzanne. Floyd eventually admits killing Michael. Investigators search. And still, the circumstances of Suzanne's death remain unresolved. It is a sequence that seems almost impossible to believe. Yet the records transformed it from rumor into an investigative history. The case also reveals something else about cold cases. Time can be both the enemy and the investigator's ally. Time destroys evidence. Memories fade. Buildings disappear. Landscapes change. People die. But time also creates technology. DNA improves. Databases grow. Old fingerprints can be compared against new records. Digital archives can reveal connections that investigators could not see decades earlier. A case that was impossible to solve in 1990 may become solvable in 2013. Not because the crime changed, because the tools changed. That is what happened with Suzanne's identity. The truth had been there all along. The DNA did not create it. It revealed it. And once the name Suzanne Marie Savakis returned to the case, the entire history could be viewed differently. The woman who died was no longer anonymous. Her childhood could be reconstructed. Her family could be located. Her disappearance could be understood. Her connection to Floyd could be investigated. The case became human again. Not just a file. Not just a victim number. Not just an old photograph. Suzanne. A daughter. A sister. A mother. A person whose life had been taken from her twice. First through the theft of her identity. Then through her death. That phrase may sound dramatic, but the evidence surrounding her identity makes the idea difficult to escape. The child Suzanne was taken away from her original family. The adult Suzanne lived under the name Tanya. And after she died, the world knew her only by the false name until investigators recovered the truth. Even death could not immediately restore the identity that had been taken from her. It took decades. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of the investigation. Suzanne had spent her life trapped inside someone else's story. The FBI eventually began pulling her out of that story. But they could not give her back the years. They could not return her childhood. They could not reunite her with her family. They could not restore the life that might have existed if she had never been taken. and they could not answer every question about her final days. That is why the case cannot be reduced to a simple headline. It is more than a murder mystery, more than a missing person case, more than a fugitive story. It is a story about identity itself. What happens when someone controls the name you answer to? What happens when official records tell the wrong story? What happens when the person closest to you is also the person who knows the most dangerous secrets about you? And what happens when the truth is discovered only after you are gone? For Suzanne, those questions are no longer theoretical. They became her life. The FBI investigation did not erase what happened, but exposed it. It showed that the woman known as Tanya Hughes had another name. It showed that her son Michael had not simply vanished without explanation. It showed that Franklin Delano Floyd had been carrying information about both of them. And it showed that even after decades, investigators were willing to return to a case that many might have considered too old to solve. Yet one mystery remained. The final moments, the vehicle, the impact, the driver, the reason. The answer may exist, but it has not been definitively established. And that is where the case remains. Not at the beginning, not at the end, somewhere in between. A place where investigators know enough to understand the horror, but not enough to close every door. The name Tanya Hughes may still appear in old documents, but the woman behind that name has another name now, Suzanne Marie Savakis. And perhaps that is the first piece of justice the investigation was able to give her. Her real name. A name that survived. A name that outlived the false identity. A name that survived the man who tried to control it. But names do not answer questions. Evidence does. And until the evidence explains how Suzanne died, the final question remains. Who was responsible? The case has survived more than 30 years because someone kept asking. Who was Tanya? Who was Suzanne? Where did she come from? What happened to her son? What happened to her? And why did so many answers remain hidden for so long? Some of those questions now have answers. Others do not. And the unanswered ones are precisely what keep the story alive. Because cold cases are not really about the passage of time. They are about the things time could not erase. A photograph, a DNA profile, a name, a confession, a memory, and a family that refused to let a missing person become a forgotten person. Suzanne Marie Savakis was missing for years. Then she was found. But she was found only after death. Her son Michael was missing for decades. His fate was finally described by the man who claimed responsibility. But his remains were not definitively recovered. And the woman at the center of both stories remained surrounded by one final unanswered mystery. The mystery of her death. More than 30 years later, the case still carries the weight of that unanswered question. Not because investigators failed to uncover the truth. They uncovered an extraordinary amount. But because some mysteries resist complete resolution. And when that happens, the responsibility passes from one generation of investigators to the next. The file remains. The name remains. The questions remain. And somewhere within those old records may still be the detail that changes everything. Until then, Suzanne's story remains a warning about how easily a life can be hidden behind a name, and how difficult it can be to recover the truth once that name is gone. For decades, the world knew Tanya Hughes. Now the world knows Suzanne Marie Savakis. But knowing her name is only part of the story. The rest remains unfinished. And the silence surrounding her final days continues to speak louder than any headline. The deeper investigators enter the story of Suzanne Marie Savakis, the more they encounter the same disturbing pattern. Nothing stayed where it appeared to belong. Names did not remain names. Families were separated. Children disappeared. Records contradicted memories. And the man at the center of the story seemed to understand exactly how to move between the cracks. Franklin Delano Floyd had spent years creating distance between himself and the truth. Sometimes the distance was geographical. Sometimes it was a different name. Sometimes it was a different story. But the greatest distance was the one he created between Suzanne and the identity she had been born with. That distance lasted for decades. By the time investigators finally connected Tanya Hughes to Suzanne, the discovery did more than identify a dead woman. It exposed an entire hidden history. Suddenly, old questions had new meanings. The people who had known Tanya were no longer simply witnesses to the death of a young woman. They were witnesses to the final chapter of Suzanne Savaki's stolen life. And the people who remembered Suzanne as a child became connected to the woman she had become. Two worlds that had been separated by decades were suddenly placed together. But one thing could not be reconstructed. Suzanne herself could not tell investigators what happened. That absence is difficult to overstate. In many investigations, the victim becomes the central source of truth. Here, the victim was silent. The person who knew the most about her life was Floyd. And Floyd had every reason to control what he said. He had survived by controlling information. He understood that information was power. If investigators knew where Suzanne came from, they could trace him. If they knew what happened to Michael, they could prosecute him. If they knew everything about his past, they could connect crimes that had once appeared unrelated. Silence had protected him. For years it worked. But eventually, investigators began breaking through that silence. The first breakthrough was identity. Tanya Hughes was Suzanne. That single fact changed the case. The second breakthrough involved Michael. Floyd admitted that the boy was dead. But the third question was the one investigators could not force open. What happened to Suzanne? The circumstances of her death remained separate from the confession about Michael. That distinction is critical. The existence of one confession does not automatically solve another death. Investigators still needed evidence. A connection. A witness. A forensic finding. Something that could transform suspicion into proof. And that evidence never fully emerged. The result was a case with an extraordinary amount of truth and one enormous unanswered question. The public often imagines a solved case as a straight line. Crime. Investigation. Suspect. Evidence. Arrest. Confession. Justice. But Suzanne's story was nothing like that. It was a maze. The crime began before investigators knew there was a crime. The victim's identity was wrong. The suspect's identity was wrong. The missing child belonged to a story that investigators had not yet fully understood. And the evidence was scattered across decades. Every new discovery forced investigators to go backward. They had to reconstruct events in reverse. They had to ask where Suzanne had been, who she had lived with, what name she had used, what records existed, what records were missing, and most importantly, why had Suzanne disappeared from her original life? Why had she become Tanya? Why was Floyd the person controlling the narrative? And what happened in Oklahoma in 1990? The answers did not arrive together. They arrived one at a time. That is why the investigation took so long. It was not simply a matter of finding one missing document. The investigators were rebuilding a life that had been deliberately fragmented. And the more they reconstructed, the clearer the danger became. Suzanne had not simply been lost. She had been controlled. Her identity had been controlled. Her movements had been controlled. Her relationships had been controlled. And eventually, her son became part of the same pattern. Michael was 6 years old when Floyd took him from school. That image alone remains difficult to forget. A normal school day. Children moving through familiar hallways. A boy who should have gone home. Instead, a man arrived and took him. The world around Michael continued. Other children went home. Parents arrived. Teachers finished the school day. But Michael disappeared. For his family, time stopped. The authorities searched. Floyd was eventually captured. But the child was gone. For years, there was no certainty about what had happened. Only the possibility that he might still be alive. That possibility is one of the cruelest parts of a missing child investigation. Hope and fear exist simultaneously. Every telephone call can be the answer. Every unidentified body can become a nightmare. Every false lead can reopen the wound. Then Floyd finally spoke. He said Michael was dead. He described the killing. He described where he claimed the boy had been buried. Investigators went there. They searched. But the physical confirmation they needed never came. The absence of remains meant the family still had no final physical answer. And once again, the case reached a boundary between what was known and what could be proven. That boundary also existed around Suzanne. Investigators knew who she was. They knew she had died. They knew the circumstances began with a traffic collision. But they did not know everything that happened around it. And that missing information became more significant once Floyd's broader history was understood. The question became unavoidable. Was Suzanne's death connected to the life she had been forced to live? Or was it an independent tragedy? The evidence available to investigators did not provide a definitive answer. That uncertainty must remain. Because the difference between suspicion and proof is the difference between a theory and a fact. In a case as disturbing as this one, the temptation to fill the gaps is enormous. But the gaps are precisely where caution matters most. What investigators could establish was already shocking. A child named Suzanne had disappeared. She had later been known as Tanya Hughes. The men around her had used false identities. Her son Michael had later disappeared. Floyd was convicted in the murder of Cheryl and Camesso. He eventually confessed to Michael's killing. And DNA linked Tanya to Suzanne. Those are not theories. Those are the pieces of a documented story. Everything beyond them requires careful distinction. That is especially important when discussing Suzanne's death. The fact that Floyd was a violent criminal does not, by itself, establish that he killed her. The fact that he knew her does not establish that he caused a collision. The fact that he disappeared afterward does not prove what happened. The unanswered question must remain an unanswered question until evidence changes it. And that may be the most frustrating reality of the entire case. The investigation got close enough to expose the hidden identity. Close enough to uncover the fate of Michael. Close enough to put Floyd behind bars. But not close enough to definitively explain Suzanne's final moments. That is what makes the case endure. The mystery is not simply that investigators failed to find an answer. It is that they found so many answers. Enough to reveal an extraordinary criminal history. Enough to rewrite the story of a missing child. Enough to restore the identity of a woman whose real name had been hidden. Yet the final question remained untouched. It is almost as if the investigation reached a locked door. Behind it was the last chapter of Suzanne's life. Investigators could see the door. They could describe it. They could establish what came before it. But they could not open it. And time only made the lock harder to break. Witnesses grow older. Memories become uncertain. People die. Records disappear. Physical evidence deteriorates. The world changes around old crime scenes. A location that once looked familiar can become unrecognizable after decades. Roads are rebuilt. Buildings are demolished. Land is developed. The landscape itself becomes another barrier between investigators and the past. Yet the FBI continued looking. That persistence matters. Because cold cases often depend on someone refusing to accept that the passage of time means the truth no longer matters. Suzanne's case is an example of what can happen when investigators return to an old file with modern tools and a different perspective. The original investigation could not see what later investigators could. The original records contained clues that only became meaningful after DNA and missing person databases developed. The identity was not necessarily impossible to discover. It was simply hidden behind the limitations of the era. That is why the case became more than an investigation into one death. It became an investigation into identity. The central question was no longer just, who killed Tanya Hughes? It became, who was Tanya Hughes? And when that question was answered, another name appeared. Suzanne. The girl who had vanished. The young woman who had become Tanya. The mother whose son would disappear. The victim whose identity was finally restored. That sequence gives a case a tragic symmetry. Suzanne was taken from her family as a child. Her son was later taken from her life. And between those two disappearances was a woman living under a name that did not belong to her. The cycle is difficult to comprehend, but it is precisely why investigators refuse to treat Tanya's case as an isolated death. There was a larger story underneath it. The discovery of Suzanne's identity reopened that story. And once reopened, it could not be ignored. Her family history mattered. Her relationship with Floyd mattered. Her son mattered. The years between her disappearance and her death mattered. Every piece became relevant. And still, the final moments remained obscure. There are cases where the truth arrives suddenly. This was not one of them. This was a slow excavation, layer by layer, name by name, year by year, until the false identity finally gave way to the real one. But when the dust cleared, the most painful question was still standing. What happened to Suzanne? The answer is not simply that she died. That much is known. The deeper question is how her life ended. Was she simply an unlucky victim of a hit and run? Was someone deliberately trying to silence her? Was the driver acting alone? Did Floyd know more? Did Suzanne know something that placed her in danger? These possibilities may be raised, but they cannot be presented as established facts. That is the line separating responsible investigation from speculation. And the documented case remains on the unresolved side of that line. For Suzanne's family, however, the uncertainty does not erase the significance of the identification. A person who had been missing was finally named. A daughter who had been separated from her family was finally returned to the family record. A woman who had died under an assumed identity was finally recognized as herself. There is something profoundly human in that, because identity is one of the most basic things a person possesses. Your name connects you to your parents, your childhood, your memories, your family, your history. Taking that name away does not merely change paperwork. It changes how the world remembers you. Suzanne lost that connection while she was still alive. The FBI eventually restored it after she was gone. But restoration could not undo the damage. It could not recover the missing years. It could not answer every question. It could not bring Michael back. And it could not reveal the person responsible for the final mystery surrounding Suzanne's death. That is why the story remains unfinished. The investigation uncovered the hidden identity. It exposed the man behind the false identity. It revealed the fate Floyd claimed for Michael. It searched for evidence. It connected decades of history. But the last answer remains outside the record. The road where Suzanne was struck still carries a question that has survived for more than 30 years. Who was behind the wheel? What happened immediately before the collision? What happened immediately afterward? And why did the story of Tanya Hughes end with so many unanswered questions? There may never be a complete answer, but the case itself has already changed. Because Tanya Hughes is no longer simply an unknown woman with a tragic ending. She has been restored to her real identity, Suzanne Marie Savakis, a name that survived the deception, a name that survived the disappearance, a name that survived death, and a name that continues to demand answers. The case may be cold, but it is not silent. Every document speaks. Every photograph speaks. Every DNA result speaks. Every confession speaks. And even the unanswered questions speak. They remind investigators that the past is not necessarily gone. Sometimes it is waiting. Waiting inside an old file. Waiting inside a forgotten memory. Waiting inside a name that was changed decades earlier. Waiting for someone to ask the right question one more time. And in Suzanne's case, that question remains the same. What really happened to her? Until someone can answer it with evidence, the mystery remains. Not Tanya Hughes. Suzanne Marie Savakis. The name matters. Because for decades, the world searched for the wrong woman. And perhaps that is why it took so long to find the truth. The name Suzanne Marie Savakis changed the investigation forever. Until that discovery, the case had been trapped inside the identity of a woman called Tanya Hughes. Tanya was the name on the records. Tanya was the name investigators searched. Tanya was the name attached to the young mother who died after the Oklahoma City collision. But Tanya was only one layer. Behind that name was Suzanne. And behind Suzanne was a childhood that had been erased. That discovery forced investigators to look backward. Not just the days before her death, not just to the years she spent in Oklahoma, but to the moment when her original identity disappeared. That meant returning to the 1970s, a different decade, a different America. Nuis Machifonis, no digital fingerprints, no nationwide databases connecting every missing child to every unidentified adult. Information traveled slowly. Records remained in filing cabinets. A child could cross a state line and become almost invisible. For someone like Floyd, that world offered opportunities. He could change a name, move to another state, create another story, and leave investigators behind. Suzanne became part of that pattern. The girl who had once belonged to a family was suddenly somewhere else. She was not simply missing. She was being absorbed into a new life. Years later, that distinction would become crucial. Because when investigators tried to understand Tanya Hughes, they were unknowingly looking at a woman whose history had already been fragmented. There were no easy answers. The name Tanya led in one direction. The biological evidence led somewhere else. The records did not immediately explain why. Then the pieces began to converge. Tanya was Suzanne. The woman who died in Oklahoma had been the child who disappeared years earlier. And the man connected to both identities was Franklin Delano Floyd. The revelation was shocking because it changed the timeline. What investigators initially saw as a tragedy in 1990 was actually the final chapter of a story that had begun decades earlier. The death was not the beginning. It was the end. The beginning was the disappearance of a child. That child grew up. She became a mother. She lived under another name. And then she died. Once investigators understood that sequence, every part of the case became more important. The relationship between Suzanne and Floyd mattered. The relationship between Suzanne and Michael mattered. The movements of Floyd mattered. His criminal history mattered. His aliases mattered. His whereabouts mattered. And every gap in the timeline mattered. Investigators began reconstructing the story with the patience required by a case that had survived decades. They could not simply ask one witness. They had to compare multiple sources. They had to determine what could be established. They had to separate fact from memory. And they had to resist the temptation to turn suspicion into certainty. That was particularly important with the death of Suzanne. The evidence established that she was struck by a vehicle. She later died from her injuries. But the larger circumstances remained unclear. There was no definitive public evidence establishing that Floyd caused the collision. There was no final confession explaining every moment. There was no complete reconstruction that answered every question. Instead, there was a blank space. And blank spaces are dangerous. They invite theories. They invite assumptions. They invite people to fill missing evidence with what they believe must have happened. But investigators work differently. They have to ask what can be proven. And in this case, the answer was incomplete. That did not make Suzanne's death less tragic. It made it more frustrating, because the investigation had already revealed so much. The false identity, the stolen childhood, the fugitive, the missing boy, the other murder, the prison interviews, the confession, the DNA, the search. So much had been uncovered, yet the most fundamental question remained. How did Suzanne die? The collision itself was only the beginning of the final mystery. What happened before it? What happened after it? Who knew where she was? Who knew what she had become? Who had contact with her? What did Floyd know? What did he refuse to say? Those questions became part of the shadow surrounding the case. But there was another question that investigators could not ignore. Why had Suzanne's original identity disappeared so completely? The answer pointed back to Floyd. He had taken her when she was a child. He had become the person controlling her environment. And eventually, she was known by another name. This was not an accidental paperwork error. It was a product of a life shaped by someone else's decisions. That fact makes the case different from an ordinary missing person investigation. The missing person was alive, but her identity was missing. And sometimes that can be just as difficult to detect. A person can attend school, work, travel, have relationships, raise children, appear in photographs, and still be invisible to the family who is looking for them. Because the name is wrong. The history is wrong. The records are wrong. That is what happened with Suzanne. She was physically present in the world, but her original identity had disappeared. Then death created another layer of invisibility. After Tanya Hughes died, the woman behind the name was gone. The truth became even harder to recover. It took years, then decades. And finally, DNA brought the identities together. The science was decisive. Tanya was Suzanne. That single result accomplished something investigators had struggled to do for years. It restored the connection between the dead woman and the missing child. Suddenly, Suzanne had a history again, a family, a birthplace, a childhood, a name. But with that history came pain, because the discovery confirmed what the family had feared. She was dead. The search for a missing daughter had ended without the reunion everyone wanted. There would be no knock on the door, no telephone call, no moment when Suzanne walked back into her family's life. Only the truth. And truth can be devastating when it arrives too late. The case then moved deeper into Floyd's history. His life was no longer simply a background detail. It became the central thread. The more investigators learned, the more obvious it became that he had lived through multiple identities. He had been a fugitive. He had been a husband under a false name. He had been connected to Suzanne. He had been connected to Michael. And he had been convicted in the murder of Cheryl and Comesso. That history made his statements especially important, but it also made them difficult to evaluate. A convicted killer can tell the truth. A convicted killer can lie. A convicted killer can mix truth with deception. Investigators must test every statement. That is exactly what they did. When Floyd claimed Michael was dead, investigators searched for physical confirmation. When he gave a location, they went there. When he described events, investigators compared them with what was already known. The search for Michael became one of the most painful chapters. Imagine the possibility that after 20 years, the child might finally be found. Imagine investigators standing over the ground where he might have been buried. Imagine the family waiting for the result. And then imagine finding nothing definitive. That is what happened. The search did not produce the final evidence everyone wanted. The mystery surrounding Michael, therefore, remained complicated. His alleged fate had been described, but his remains were not recovered. And for families, that distinction can be enormous. A confession can tell you something, but physical remains can give you finality. Without them, uncertainty can survive. That same uncertainty surrounds Suzanne's death. The difference is that Suzanne's body was recovered. She was identified. Her death was documented. But the complete circumstances of how she came to die remained uncertain. In one case, the body was missing. In the other, the answer was missing. Both mysteries were connected to the same man. That is what makes the story so disturbing. Floyd's presence stretches across the timeline like a shadow. But shadows are not evidence. They are patterns. And investigators need more than patterns. They need proof. That is why the official history of Suzanne's death must be treated carefully. There is a temptation to say the entire case was solved when DNA identified her. But that would be wrong. The DNA solved the identity mystery. It did not automatically solve the death. It transformed the investigation. It gave investigators the real name. It opened the door to her family history. It connected her to Floyd's past. But it did not answer every question about the collision. That distinction is perhaps the most important fact in understanding this case. A cold case can contain solved mysteries and unsolved mysteries at the same time. Tanya's identity was solved. Michael's fate was partially revealed. Floyd's criminal identity was established. But Suzanne's death remained surrounded by unanswered questions. That is why the story has endured. It is not a simple tale of investigators finding a killer after decades. It is a story of investigators peeling away layers of deception. First the name, then the childhood, then the missing child, then the criminal history, and finally, the unanswered death. Each layer exposed another. Each answer created another question. And at the center of the investigation was a woman who could no longer explain herself. Suzanne had been silent for decades because she was gone. Floyd had been silent because he chose when to speak. That imbalance shaped the investigation. The victim could not correct the story. The suspect could. And that meant investigators had to rely on evidence rather than words. Every statement had to be tested. Every claim had to be examined. Every location had to be searched. Every identity had to be confirmed. The investigation became an exercise in separating what Floyd wanted investigators to hear from what the evidence could actually support. That is the challenge of any case involving a serial deceiver. The truth may be buried beneath several layers of lies. And sometimes even the truth, once uncovered, is incomplete. For Suzanne, one truth is undeniable. She deserved to be remembered by her real name, not merely as Tanya Hughes. not merely as the victim of a collision, not merely as the mother of a missing boy, but as Suzanne Marie Savakis, a daughter, a sister, a mother, a human being whose childhood was taken from her. Her identity was not a footnote. It was the key to understanding her entire story. Without the name Suzanne, investigators could not fully understand Tanya. Without Tanya, the story of Suzanne's final years remained hidden. The two identities had to be brought together. Only then could the full timeline emerge. And when it did, it revealed something that had been invisible for years. The victim had been living under a false identity. The suspect had been living under another false identity. The child at the center of the case had been taken by the same man. And the investigation itself had to cross decades to reconstruct the truth. That is why the case remains one of the most haunting examples of how a person's identity can disappear without the person physically disappearing. Suzanne was alive. She was seen. She was known. But the world knew her by the wrong name. Then she died. And the world lost even the visible version of her. For years, Tanya was all that remained. Then investigators found Suzanne, not in a new location, not alive, but inside the evidence, inside the DNA, inside the old records, inside the memories of people who had known her before she disappeared. The discovery was not a rescue. It was a recovery of identity, a recovery of history, a recovery of a name, but not a recovery of life. That distinction gives the case its lasting sadness. Because no investigation can give back the years stolen from Suzanne. No conviction can restore the childhood she lost. No DNA test can return her to her family. No confession can erase the years of uncertainty. And no search can change the fact that she died before the truth about her identity was uncovered. Still, the investigation mattered. Because without it, Tanya Hughes might have remained only Tanya Hughes. A name, a death, a file. Instead, investigators discovered Suzanne. They gave the woman behind the false identity back to history. And that matters. Because victims should not disappear twice. Suzanne had already disappeared once as a child. She should not have disappeared again after death. Her name is now known. Her story is now documented. Her connection to Floyd is established. Her son's disappearance is part of the record. And the remaining mystery has a clear shape. It is no longer a question of who Tanya was. We know she was Suzanne. The question is what happened to her. That question remains. It sits at the end of the timeline. Everything leads toward it. The childhood, the disappearance, the false identity, the motherhood, the Oklahoma years, the collision, the hospital, the death, the investigation, the DNA, the confession, the search, and then silence. A silence that has lasted for decades. Perhaps someone knows. Perhaps someone once knew and never spoke. Perhaps the evidence has already disappeared. Perhaps the final answer was lost the moment the vehicle left the scene. Or perhaps the truth is still somewhere in the world, waiting for another investigator to recognize a connection that earlier generations could not see. That possibility is what keeps cold cases alive. Because evidence can sleep. It does not necessarily die. A record can survive. A photograph can survive. DNA can survive. A witness can remember. And sometimes, decades later, the smallest detail becomes a key to an entire case. That is what happened when investigators finally discovered Suzanne beneath Tanya. A name became a doorway. And behind that doorway was a life that had been hidden for more than 20 years. But beyond that life is another door. The final one. The door to Suzanne's death. That door remains closed. And until it opens, the story of Tanya Hughes remains unfinished. Not because the victim has been forgotten, but because she has finally been remembered correctly. Suzanne Marie Savakis. That is the name that survived. And that is the name that still waits for the final answer.